The boardroom on the 32nd floor smelled like floor wax and someone else's ambition. I'd been in rooms like this before, not as a guest, not as a junior partner, but as the man who quietly owned a significant piece of what everyone else in the room was fighting over. Nobody knew that. That was the point. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm 64 years old. I live in a house in Cobourg, Ontario, that backs onto a creek, and in the summer, you can sit on the back deck and hear nothing but water and the occasional blue jay. My wife thinks I retired early from project management. My brother-in-law thinks I'm a charity case. For 31 years, I let both of them believe whatever they wanted. I should back up. I met Sylvia in the spring of 1993 at a fundraiser for the Cobourg Hospital Foundation. She was helping set up folding chairs and I was volunteering at the registration table, mostly because my supervisor at the time had strongly implied that community involvement looked good for the company. Sylvia had her hair pulled back and a smear of lipstick on her front tooth that nobody had told her about. And when I finally leaned over and quietly pointed it out, she laughed so hard she knocked over an entire stack of programs. That was it for me. I knew before the evening was over. Her father, Leonard Whitmore, was not at the fundraiser. He was never at anything that didn't directly benefit Leonard Whitmore. He was a self-made man. He'd say that himself, loudly, at every dinner table he ever sat at. Who had built Whitmore Industrial Supply into one of the largest privately held distribution companies in Ontario. 42 years of grinding, he'd say. 42 years of nobody giving me a damn thing. He had the kind of pride that wasn't really pride at all, but something harder and colder that just wore pride's clothing. When Sylvia brought me home to meet him, I was 33 years old and driving a 2001 Civic with a heating system that worked intermittently. He looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's considering donating. His wife Eleanor, a quiet, careful woman who had learned over decades to take up as little space as possible, shook my hand warmly and asked me if I'd eaten. Leonard asked me what I did. I told him I was in supply chain logistics, which was true. I had spent nearly a decade working in procurement and vendor management, and I had a very specific kind of expertise that, at that point in my life, I was just beginning to understand the value of. I had also, over the previous 4 years, been making a series of quiet investments that my financial advisor kept telling me were either very smart or very reckless, and that we'd know which in about a decade. Leonard nodded slowly when I explained this, in the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. Sylvia's brother, Vincent, was 28 at the time and already working at Whitmore Industrial in a director-level role that he had, by all accounts, been born into rather than earned. He had their father's jaw and their father's certainty and none of their mother's warmth. He shook my hand at that first dinner and said, genuinely curious, "So what exactly do you bring to the table, Arthur?" I smiled and said I was still figuring that out. He laughed like that confirmed something he'd already decided. Sylvia and I married in the fall of 1994. Small ceremony, St. Peter's Anglican in Cobourg, 38 guests. Leonard gave a toast at the reception that was mostly about himself. We moved into a house on Division Street that we could afford. 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, a backyard that needed work. Sylvia taught elementary school. I continued doing what I'd been doing, which was working, saving, and investing. Carefully and without fanfare. We had a daughter, Joanna, in 1997, then a son, Patrick, in 2000. Leonard visited 4 times in the first 10 years of our marriage. Each time, he walked through our house with the quiet assessment of a building inspector noting deficiencies. He never said anything openly critical. He didn't need to. There was a particular way he looked at the kitchen countertops, a particular pause he took at the entrance to the living room. Eleanor always squeezed my hand on the way out and said the house was lovely. What Leonard didn't know, what nobody in that family knew, was that beginning in 1998, I had been gradually and systematically acquiring shares in a small but growing manufacturing tech company called Caldwell Precision Systems, based out of Oshawa. I'd been watching them for 3 years before I first invested. A friend from my logistics days had consulted for them early on and mentioned, offhandedly, that their supply chain IP was something genuinely unusual. I did my homework. Then I did more homework. Then I started buying. By 2004, I held just under 12%. By 2009, through a combination of direct purchase and a rights offering that most smaller shareholders passed on, I was at 19. The 2008 financial crisis was painful for everyone, but it was, if I'm honest, the moment that changed my life. I had cash savings, no debt, and the discipline to buy aggressively when every instinct said the world was ending. When the market recovered, I owned 29% of Caldwell Precision Systems. It's worth mentioning here that I never worked for Caldwell. I had no official role. I attended shareholder meetings. I voted my shares. I received quarterly reports and annual dividends that I had deposited into an account that I kept separate from our joint finances, because I had long ago decided that I needed to understand what this was before I told Sylvia about it. That decision became a habit. The habit became years. The years became almost 2 decades of sitting across from my father-in-law at holiday dinners, while he described me to his golf friends as Sylvia's husband does something in logistics. The thing is, I never minded. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't strategic silence, born from spite. I grew up in Trenton, the son of a machinist and a school secretary. We were not wealthy. I watched my father work himself into a bad back and a modest pension, and I watched him be content with that, genuinely, because the money had never been the point. The point was the house and the creek in the Saturday mornings. The point was Joanna doing her homework at the kitchen table while Patrick watched hockey in the next room. None of that required me to be acknowledged by Leonard Whitmore. But I will tell you that there were moments. There was a Christmas dinner in 2011 when Vincent, who had by then been made Chief Operating Officer of Whitmore Industrial, a title his father had given him with great ceremony at a company event I was not invited to, spent 40 minutes explaining to me, in small, careful words, why the Canadian manufacturing sector was structurally unsound and unlikely to recover. I ate my turkey and agreed with him on several minor points. That same week, Caldwell Precision had signed a distribution contract that would double their revenue over the following 3 years. I did not mention this. There was a summer barbecue in 2016 when Leonard told me in front of Sylvia and Eleanor and both of our children that he was considering whether to bring Joanna into the Whitmore business after she graduated from Queen's, because the company needs young blood with actual business instincts. He looked at me when he said it, not at Joanna, at me. I put a piece of chicken on my plate and said that Joanna would make her own decisions, which she would because we had raised her to. I was, by 2016, a shareholder at 36%. Caldwell Precision had grown considerably. Their annual revenue was approaching $400 million. The company was valued, conservatively, by a firm I had hired independently, at just over $1.1 billion. Sylvia knew about the investments in general terms. She knew we were comfortable. She knew I had made good decisions with money over the years. What she did not know was the scale. I had told her early on that I had investments I was monitoring, and that I would explain them fully when I understood their trajectory. That was 2001. I kept waiting for the right moment. The right moment kept being almost now and then not quite. I'm not proud of that. It sits with me still. She is the most honest person I have ever known, and I chose, for reasons that were partly practical and partly cowardly, to keep her in partial darkness for longer than I should have. That's the truth of it. The moment that forced everything into the open was not one I chose. It came on a Sunday evening in March of 2023, when Vincent called me, not Sylvia, me, and asked if he could come by the following Saturday. He said he had something he wanted to discuss. His voice had a particular texture to it that I recognized from 30 years of watching him, the careful steadiness of someone who has already decided something and is now managing the announcement. He arrived at 11 in the morning. Sylvia had taken Patrick, who was visiting with his wife and their 2 children, to the farmer's market in town. Vincent sat at our kitchen table with a coffee mug in both hands and told me that he had been approached by a private equity group interested in acquiring Whitmore Industrial. He told me the family was considering it seriously. He told me the valuation discussions were ongoing. Then he told me why he was there. He had, through some research that he described as due diligence on the family's behalf, become aware of a significant shareholder in Caldwell Precision Systems. He had been aware of Caldwell for years because Whitmore Industrial had done business with them intermittently. What he had not been aware of was the identity of that shareholder. Until recently. He set his coffee down. "It's you," he said. "You own 38% of Caldwell Precision." I looked at him. "The Caldwell people wouldn't confirm it," he said. "But the corporate registry filings are public. I had someone look." He paused. "Caldwell is valued right now at somewhere between 900 million and 1.2 billion, depending on who's asking." He did the math in the silence between us. "You've been sitting on this for how long?" 25 years, I said. He was quiet for a long time. I watched something move across his face that I couldn't entirely read. It was not quite embarrassment. It was more like the sensation of standing on a floor you thought was solid and feeling it flex slightly underfoot. "Dad doesn't know," he said finally. "No. Sylvia doesn't know." I didn't answer that one directly. I said I was going to tell her. "When?" "Soon." He was quiet again. Then he asked me something I hadn't expected. He asked me if I would be willing to use my position at Caldwell, my influence as the majority individual shareholder, to support a partnership deal he was structuring between Whitmore Industrial and a Caldwell subsidiary. He explained the details carefully. It was not an unreasonable idea on its merits. But the way he framed it, the particular shape of the ask, made clear that he believed that my hidden position was now something he could use. That the secret, now that he knew it, had shifted power in his direction. I told him I would think about it. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The creek was running fast. It does in March with the snowmelt, and I could hear it from the back of the house. I thought about 25 years of Christmas dinners and summer barbecues, and a man who had looked at me for 3 decades and seen someone useful at best, decorative at worst. I thought about Eleanor, who had always been kind. I thought about Sylvia, who deserved to know the truth and had deserved it for years. When Sylvia came home that afternoon, I asked her to sit down. Patrick and his wife took the grandchildren for a walk. I talked for almost 2 hours. I told her everything. Not just the Caldwell shares, but all of it. The timeline, the dividends, the separate account, the decision to wait that became a decision to keep waiting. I showed her the documents. She didn't say anything for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "I wondered." I looked at her. "You were too calm," she said. "When we had the hot water tank go in 2009, and you said not to worry about it. When Patrick needed the dental work, and you said the same thing. I wondered what you weren't telling me." She looked at the papers on the table. "I just thought it was smaller than this." She wasn't angry in the way I had feared. She was something more complicated than angry. She was hurt, and she was processing it carefully, and she asked me questions that night that I answered as honestly as I could, and we went to bed without fully resolving it, and we spent the following week having the conversations we should have been having for years. I'm telling you this because I think it matters. The secret wasn't triumphant. It wasn't a power move. It was a choice I made for complicated reasons that became a wall I had to slowly dismantle with my own hands, while the person I'd built the wall around watched me do it. It cost something real. I want you to understand that. The Vincent situation resolved itself more cleanly. I called my lawyer, Priya, who had been managing my corporate interests for 12 years and who had, over that time, developed a precise and formidable manner with people who overestimated their position. I explained what Vincent had asked. She listened. Then she drafted a letter to Vincent on firm letterhead that outlined in clear and measured language that any attempt to leverage knowledge of my shareholding position for the purpose of influencing corporate negotiations would be treated as a matter of legal consequence. She also sent a separate communication to the Caldwell board informing them of the approach because she felt they should be aware. Vincent called me the evening after he received the letter. He was quiet and controlled, which told me he was genuinely unsettled. "I wasn't threatening you," he said. "I know," I said. "The letter wasn't about what you meant to do. It was about what you actually did." There was a long pause. "Dad's going to find out," he said. "Yes," I said. "He is." Leonard found out on a Thursday afternoon in April. Vincent told him, which was the right call, because I had made clear through Priya that if Vincent didn't, I would. I wasn't interested in another decade of managed information. I was 63 years old and tired of carefully parceled truth. Sylvia and I drove to her parents' home in Port Hope the following Saturday. It's a large house on the lake. Beautiful, genuinely, whatever I think of the man who owns it. Eleanor met us at the door. She held Sylvia's hands for a moment and didn't say anything and didn't need to. Leonard was in the sitting room. He looked smaller to me than he had in years, though he hadn't changed. He had a glass of water on the table beside him, and he was looking out at the lake. He didn't stand up when I came in. "Sit down," he said. I sat. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" It was not the question I had expected. I had expected challenge, indignation, the particular performance of wounded authority. Instead, he just asked me why, in a voice that was almost, not quite, simply curious. I thought about it. "Because it wasn't about you," I said. "It was never about you." He looked at the lake. "I treated you like you were nobody." "Yes." "And you just—" He stopped. "You just let me." "I had a life I was happy with," I said. "You thinking I was nobody didn't change that." Eleanor brought tea and left the room quietly. Sylvia sat next to me and didn't say anything. And that was right, because this was something the two of us needed to finish. Leonard was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I have thought about since. He said, "I worked my whole life so that my children wouldn't have to worry about money. I thought that was the thing." He picked up his water glass, then set it down. "You had money, and you were still worried about something else entirely." That was, in its way, more self-awareness than I had credited him with. I didn't sell the Caldwell shares. I didn't restructure anything. The private equity interest in Whitmore Industrial eventually went through a different path, and Vincent managed that process largely on his own, and Whitmore Industrial is still operating. Which is fine. I had no interest in any of that. What changed is smaller and larger at the same time. Eleanor calls us more. Sylvia and her father talk now with the directness they didn't have before, which is a complicated gift but a real one. Vincent and I are not close, but we are honest with each other, and that's more than we were. Sylvia and I had a long conversation last fall on the back deck, watching the creek. She asked me if I regretted not telling her sooner. I told her, yes, genuinely, because I do. She asked me if I would do it differently. I said I would, and I meant it. She was quiet for a while. The creek was running low, the way it does in October. Then she said, "You know what the strangest part is? The money doesn't feel like anything. It's just a number." I told her that was the whole point. She nodded slowly. "I think I would have married you anyway," she said, "even if you'd been broke your whole life." "I know," I said. "But it would have been nice to know sooner," she said, "that we were okay." That one stayed with me. That's the part I got wrong more than anything. Not the secret itself, not the scale of it, but the years of letting her wonder if we were okay when we were in fact more than okay. And she had deserved to know that, and I had kept it from her anyway. The Sunday morning breakfasts are the same. The walks along the creek path. The evenings reading beside each other in the sitting room while the house makes its small sounds around us. None of that required 38% of anything. That's what I know now. That's what I should have known all along. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, not looking for anything in particular, just feeling the weight of it. What I keep coming back to is not the money. It was never really about the money. What I keep coming back to is a Tuesday evening in 1998, sitting at the kitchen table in that small house on Division Street, looking at a quarterly report for a company most people had never heard of, and deciding, quietly, without ceremony, that I was going to be patient, that I was going to do the work, that I was going to keep my head down and let the results speak for themselves, someday, when the time was right. That decision, made alone in a dim kitchen while Sylvia was reading in the next room and Joanna was asleep upstairs, changed the shape of the next 25 years of my life. I think about cause and effect a lot. Not in any mystical sense, I'm too practical for that, but in the plain, honest sense that the things we choose to do and the things we choose not to do accumulate. They compound, the same way money does. Every year I made a careful decision at Caldwell. Every quarterly report I read with discipline when the market was telling me to panic. Every Christmas dinner I sat through while Leonard looked past me towards some more interesting corner of the room. All of it was building something, not a fortune exactly, a foundation. And foundations hold weight you don't always see until someone decides to test them. Vincent tested mine, and I think, in his own way, he taught me something I hadn't expected to learn at 63. He showed me that integrity without courage is incomplete. I had done the right things financially for decades. I had been disciplined and careful and patient, but I had also been avoiding a harder kind of honesty, the kind you owe the people who share your life. I had been telling myself that protecting Sylvia from the complexity was a form of care. It wasn't. It was a form of distance, dressed up as consideration. The courage I showed in business, I had quietly withheld at home. When Vincent forced the truth into the open, he accidentally gave me the chance to correct that. Sylvia said she had wondered. That's the sentence I'll carry the longest. Not the number on the Caldwell valuation report. Not Priya's letter on firm letterhead. Not the look on Leonard's face when he asked me why I hadn't told him. Just those 4 words from my wife, spoken without accusation, in the kitchen of a house backed up against a creek in Cobourg, Ontario. She had wondered. She'd carried that quiet uncertainty for years and handled it with more grace than I had any right to expect. What I understand now, in a way I couldn't fully articulate at 33, is that real steadiness, the kind that actually matters, has 3 parts that have to work together. There's the integrity to do the right thing when no one is watching, when there's no reward and no acknowledgement. There's the judgment to understand what you're building, to read situations clearly and make decisions that hold up over time. And there's the endurance to keep going through the years when the results aren't visible yet, when the people around you have already decided who you are, and you have to resist the temptation to correct them prematurely, or bitterly, or for the wrong reasons. I got 2 of those right for a long time. The third one, the courage to be fully honest with the person who mattered most. That one I came to late. It's not too late. That's the other thing I know now. The creek is still running. Sylvia is still here. Some things you get to fix, if you're willing to do the work.